Hello and welcome back. In this video we'll continue discussing the foundations of sequence alignment. In our previous two videos in this section we covered the why and the what, as well as the visual dot matrix approach or dot plot approach to alignment. Here we'll delve into the classic dynamic programming method that builds on the dot plot approach but adds a more quantitative component to it. And we're going to focus initially on global alignment and then move on to local alignment and its adaptation for database searching with the BLAST approach and the various heuristics that are used to enable the efficient searching of large-scale biomolecular databases. So now the dynamic programming approach that we're focusing on here in this video, it can be thought of as an extension to the dot plot approach that we've already discussed. Again, we start in the same way. One sequence is placed down the side of a little table or grid, or what we'll call an alignment matrix from now on, and another across the top. We'll call this step one of this approach. Now, instead of placing a dot, as we would in the dot plot approach, inside our grid where the characters match, what we're going to do is compute a score for each cell in our little table, or for each positional correspondence. And then in our final step, we're going to go through and look at those numbers and find the path through that little alignment matrix that gives the best possible score. That's our third step in this dynamic programming approach, in this overview. Now we're going to dig into more details in a moment, but I want to reiterate an important point that we learned from our dot plot approach. That is, just like with dot plots, we're again looking for diagonal paths or runs, these red lines that I'm showing here in these little alignment matrices, because these paths, whenever you move diagonally, they represent different alignments. So different paths will represent different character correspondences, which in turn will represent different alignments. That is because different cells in the table represent different rows and columns, which represent different sequence positions. Okay. So now the key point again that we saw in the dot plot approach is that if we ever move horizontally, that's straight across, or vertically straight down, so that means not diagonally, then we're talking about indels. We're talking about putting gaps in one sequence or the other, depending upon which way you move. Now we'll come back to this again, but it is an important point. I want to stress that, is that we need to put gaps in one sequence or the other, depending on whether the path moves vertically or horizontally. And what we're really after are these straight shot diagonals. Okay. Now the classic algorithm in this vein is known as Needleman-Wunsch, and that's named after the original authors of this Journal of Molecular Biology paper, or JMB paper, back in 1970, Needleman and Wunsch. So let's walk through the fundamentals of this approach. So there are three basic steps proposed by Needleman and Wunsch in their original algorithm, and we'll walk through them. We've actually already covered them, but we'll build up our knowledge of them here and delve into a little bit more detail. The first one is we set up our little 2D grid. This again looks much like our dot plot that we've talked about before, but it's got one important difference. Note that I've got these one additional column and one additional row that I'm coloring in gray here. These represent gaps, and we'll come back to them in a second, but these initial columns and initial rows, they're added in this Needleman-Wunsch approach to initialize our problem, and we're going to use those along with a gap score to start our cells off in this approach. So then once we've gone through in step two, we score the matrix, we add all our numbers instead of putting dots here, of course. And then finally in step three, once we've filled in every cell in the table, we go back from the filled in numbers and identify the optimal path through the matrix that takes us from one corner to the other. From the bottom corner, for example, that would be where the end of the two sequences are, the last position in the table, all the way back to the start, to the first position. That would be the start of the two sequences that path would represent. Okay, so let's look at this in a little more detail. Now recall in our first video, when we were looking, the first video in the segment I should say, when we were looking at alignments that we liked and which was the best of these three different possibilities for these sequences that I had colored in a very Irish patriotic way, these green, white and orange sequences, and I asked you which one did you like the best, and we kind of talked through it, and we thought, oh, we like matches, we'll put a value on those that's positive and large maybe, and we don't really like gaps, right? We think they're probably costly in evolutionary terms, or might be detrimental to the function of these sequences, so we put some minus number, and we weren't really sure about mismatches, but we picked a number that was lower than the matches, for example. So we're going to do the same thing here, so that's in the little red box here. We're picking a match score, a mismatch score, and a gap score. I'll also use the term gap penalty because it's usually negative. We typically don't like these gap occurrences. And as I said, Needleman and Wunsch, it starts by initializing this first row and first column of the matrix and puts a gap character right there. So what we'll do is we'll take that gap score, the gap penalty, and we'll put it in those columns and rows. And just like we did before with those Irish sequences, we summed up all the numbers of matches and the numbers of mismatches and got a value. We're going to do the same here in this approach. We're going to keep summing up. So I start by putting in the gap. And this would represent sequence 1, the D, the first position of sequence 1, matched to a gap, as I'm showing here. So I'll go to my scores and I say -2. Okay, so 0 plus -2 is -2, and I put it in the cell. And then I add another gap. So this would be the P of sequence 1, the D and P both aligned to a gap. And this would have a score of -4 because it's 2 gaps. And I continue, so this would be plus another -2, and this would be plus another -2. So I filled in this first column. And I can do the same for the first row. And again here we see that at each step we're just adding up the gap penalty to the accumulated score that we had in the previous cell to yield the value for the particular cell we're on, what I'm calling I and J here with the little blue subscripts that you might use if you wanted to put this in a more mathematical basis, as we'll do in a moment. So now the fun starts. We can go finally to one of these cells that represents the actual sequence, right? This corner cell is actually the only one we can do so far. It's the only one we can do because it's the only one with 3 values that precede it. See the way it's got the values up above it, the -2 right on top of the orange cell here. It's also got the -2 right to the left of it, and it's also got the 0 diagonally before it. It's got the I -1 and the J -1 positions all filled in, because we're going to use these preceding positions when we make our little sums to figure out what to put here instead of the question mark, what to fill in this cell. Okay, so let's consider this IJ position. What's the score? What's SIJ for this position? Again, as I've said, we're going to use the 3 preceding values to try and determine what to put in this. Which of these 3 preceding values, or which of the 3 directions, if you will, if we're using little arrows, will give the highest score? We're interested in high scores. High scores mean good things, more aligned things, right? So we're going to try and find those. So let's zoom in here and look at these 3 cells to figure out which one is best. So I'm zoomed in here on the panel here, and I'm going to figure out which of these black arrow roots, root 1, which is the diagonal one I'm showing here, or root 2, which is the one straight down from up above, or root 3 from the left position here, yield the highest score when I sum them up with my either my gap score or my mismatch score in this case. Okay, so let's have a look. Another way again to write this would be if we were using this I and J syntax, where I -1 and J -1 would be the root 1, and I -1 J would be the root 2 here, the preceding above score, and finally the root 3 would be the I J -1 score. Okay, so we're going to look for the maximum of all those possible scores when we put them in something like this. What's the maximum for the cell I'm sitting on, the SIJ, of those 3 preceding cells when you either take the match or the mismatch score? That is only if you move diagonally, remember. And then it's going to be using the gap penalty or the gap score if you ever move root 2 or root 3. That's the straight down or the straight across. So we're going to hit on this quite a few times and iterate on it. That's how we're going to learn it, by practicing and filling these in and learning how to do it. Let me walk through putting this value in. So here we consider root 1, and we would take the preceding score for the diagonal, the SI -1, J -1 value, which is 0 in this case, and we go and we look at what characters we're dealing with, and it's a D and a D. So that means these characters are the same. So we're going to use our match score, okay? So here we're going to use 0 plus 1, that yields plus 1. And then if we're going to do the root 2 or the root 3, remember that if we ever move straight down or straight across, just like with the dot plots, we're putting an indel, we're putting gaps in one sequence or the other. So we're going to have to take the gap score. -2 plus -2 is -4, and that's the same for both roots here. And that value is not as high as the plus 1. So I'm going to take my best score, the maximum score, that's the diagonal one, put it in the cell, so plus 1's written in here in the orange position, and I keep the direction arrow. I keep the little arrow, the route that I went to get this score, because I'm going to need those later, as you'll see, to find the actual path through the matrix when we trace back at the end. So let's move on. If we follow the same procedure here, it's always the same to fill in all these little positions. We're going to consider all 3 roots and take the maximum value and store that direction along with the little arrow that yielded it. So in this case, it's root 3 that gives the best score, because it's the plus 1, and I'm going to have to add on the gap score because I'm moving straight across. That yields a value of -1, so I store that along with my arrow. And let's move on. It's the same deal here. Again, root 3 give the best score of the 3 roots. I have to try all 3 roots because I don't know beforehand which one is going to yield the maximum value. So I try all 3 and I keep track of the best one here. So I do that. And then I move on. So here I jumped a few ahead. Again, it's root 3 that yielded this because I'm taking the value in the immediately preceding cell to the left, +2 plus -2, which equals 0. So I put that in the cell, keep the arrows as I go, and I keep on going. At each step, you should notice here that the score in the current cell is determined by the scores in the preceding cells. And that, in turn, is determined by the scores in the preceding cells before that, and so forth, and so forth. Okay, so I keep going until I filled up the entire matrix. And I've arrived at the end, and I'm happy, right? So I filled in all the cells, and I'm in my kind of happy place here. And this is a happy place not just because I'm finished, but it's because it yields the optimal alignment score for these 2 sequences. In this case, the optimal alignment score for these 2 sequences is +2. And I get it from this happy place, this end position, where j equals the length of that sequence and I equals the length of the other sequence, because that's the end of the 2 sequences. That's where I've matched all possible character correspondences between these 2 sequences and arrived at my best answer, because I'm doing this maximum value at each step. I've found the best possible value for these, and that's my happy place. That's my optimal alignment score for these 2 sequences. So if, for example, I had another sequence and matched it with sequence 1 here, and it yielded a alignment score of +4, that would mean that these 2 sequences are more similar to each other than my original 2 sequences, because they yielded a higher score than the +2 sequences. The +4 yielding sequences would be more similar. This is something that would be very hard to get from a dot plot, where you just have to visually look at it and say, oh, is there more dots? Is that sneeze look better than this sneeze on my screen? Here, there's no ambiguity. I can just tell by the value, the answer, the numeric values that we put on these things. So, to find the alignment that actually yielded that optimal score, what we do is we trace back our droppings. We go from that end position where I equals m and j equals m, that happy place, and go back through our little table, our alignment matrix, following our arrows all the way back to the start. So we're back at the initial cell, the first 2 characters in these sequences. So we're retracing back to the start, the first cell in the matrix, and that will yield our character correspondences. We just read them out from the columns and rows of those particular cells. So, question. What is the optimal score for the alignment of these 2 sequences? Here I've filled in the Needleman-Wunsch dynamic programming matrix for you. What is the optimal score for these 2 sequences? Well, hopefully you were beginning to look at that happy place. The optimal alignment score for the Needleman-Wunsch approach this global alignment approach, as we'll discuss what that means in a second, it's always here in the last cell. That's our happy place. In this case, it's +2. So the second part of this question is, how do we find the alignment, the arrangement of these two sequences that yielded that optimal alignment score? Well, in this case, we just trace those arrows back from that happy place all the way back to the start, to the first cell. So here I'm showing one possible route in these red outlined cells, tracing them all the way back to the start. Now, if you had really good eyes and were looking at this closely, you might see something that actually we find a lot. Sometimes there are more than one alignments that result in the same score. That is, there's often multiple arrows coming out of a cell, going into other cells that we can follow. There are different paths that we can trace through this matrix, like this one in green here compared to this one in red. Now this yields a different alignment because it's a different path through the matrix. It's a different character correspondence of these two sequences, but they yield exactly the same optimal alignment score. These two alignments, like the red and the green one shown here, they're indistinguishable for us. They both yield the same score. Okay, this is very much like back in you remember that first video we had in this segment where we had our Irish sequences, our green, white and orange sequences, and we had this little T that could move across, slide across from one position to the other, and it wouldn't change the number of matches or mismatches or gaps. It just could move, and it would have exactly the same score. This is the same scenario here. This is how this is captured in this dynamic programming approach. This matrix, at its heart, captures all possible arrangements of these two sequences. So both these alignments in red and green yield the same score here. This is an important point. Now, another really important point, equally as important, is that the alignment path and the score are dependent on the scoring scheme that we actually choose to use here, right? That is, here in this example, what I've done is I've just changed that gap penalty that I used in the previous slide from -2 to -3, and that'll obviously change the values in the table because I'm using different values when I calculate my little sums for every cell, and it'll obviously change then the last value, the happy place value, the optimal alignment score, but it also potentially changes the path through the matrix, and that will give us a different alignment like the one shown here in blue. So this is a really important point and one that's often underappreciated. That is that the optimal alignment solutions and their score, so that's the value we get in our happy place, are not necessarily unique. That is, there's more than one route through the matrix to yield this score, and they depend on the scoring scheme. If I pick different values, they might give you, or in fact they will give you most likely, different scores. So they're dependent on the scores you use. Bummer. Now we're going to talk a little bit later about where these scores typically come from. At the minute, I've just picked these scores from the air, from random. I could have picked different scores, and that will change our answers. Okay, this is important. And it's an important limitation, of course. Okay, now I would like you to take this alignment problem shown here. So these are another two sequences, and I'm giving you a match score, a mismatch score, and a gap penalty or gap score here of -2 in this case, and use the Needleman-Wunsch approach that we've just walked through and solve it. Fill in the values in this table and tell me what the optimal alignment score is for these two sequences and what were the alignments that yielded that score. So you'll have to trace back from it. Now I'm looking at the time of the video, or how much I've been talking for. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move this to our hands-on session, so you'll have a chance to do this in our hands-on worksheet, and I'll maybe give you a little clue, because one important thing you'll see is that errors propagate in this approach. If you make a little mistake somewhere in the middle of this table, it's likely to propagate and give you the wrong final answer, and whether you get the right answer or the wrong answer isn't as critical as learning the mechanics at this stage. We're going to get lots of practice of doing these things and iterate on it. That's how we'll learn. So the optimal alignment score here, I'll tell you, you should get a value of +4 for these two sequences. That would be the value that you put in the happy place right at the end. So check yourself as you go through. Do you get that value? Have you figured out the mechanics of considering those three preceding routes, summing them up, taking the gap score if you're ever moving across or down, and then considering the match or the mismatch score depending upon what the characters are in the two sequences if you move diagonally. And with that, I'll move the next portion. That's how we adapt this method that we've done here to local alignment. It's a simple modification of what we're doing here to allow for local matching, and then that can be used for searching databases, so the so-called BLAST approach. And we'll cover that in our next video.